Guilty Gear X, the first Dreamcast and PlayStation 2 game within the series, and a huge leap compared to their first Guilty Gear game on the PS1. As much as I loved the Guilty Gear series, Guilty Gear X was a bit of a surprise for me. When I ended up replaying the game and finished every character on the arcade mode, I was actually amazed how the game really improved a lot compared to their first game before. Not only in terms of graphics, but the overall quality of it seemed better. But at the same time, a bit disappointed on how it feels like a rush-developed game. Especially when you consider there's 4 different versions of the game, with a few changes in the middle. There's Guilty Gear X, Guilty Gear X Plus, Guilty Gear Advanced Edition, and Guilty Gear X version 1.5. I know it kinda sounds a lot. It even reminded me a bit of how Kingdom Hearts does it, although I'll be focusing more on the main first version instead, while pointing out the difference on some of the other versions. Except for the Advanced Edition, considering it's an understandable port. This is K1PM, and today I'll be doing a full review of Guilty Gear X. Gonna talk more in depth about the game and pointing out the pros and the cons of it.
ねえねえジョニー、手加減してくれるよね。
ダメ。
意地悪。
残念でした。
Guilty Gear X was released on July 2000 at the arcade in Japan. Then a few years later, a port version of the game released in Dreamcast and PlayStation 2 at these dates. The developers are the same Arc System Works, who've made these games that you might know, while the team in charge would be the same ones who've made the first game, Team Neoblood, which led by Daisuke Ishibatari himself. The plot takes place less than a year after the incident with Justice on the first Guilty Gear game. As the public learns to fear what the Gears can do, an anti-Gear sentiment grows wary. Later on, a report came addressing about a self-reliant Gear that seemed peaceful despite numerous failed attempts were made of disposing it. During times of escalating tensions, a bounty was made of worth 500,000 world dollars to whoever disposes the Gear. This ends up attracting a lot of different bounty hunters on the offer. But of course, no average bounty hunter can fight against it, especially when that Gear itself is dizzy. And beside her is Testament himself again, acting as the second final boss in the game. Now, the total character roster within the game is now at 17, 4 new characters and 3 unlockable ones. There's also 2 hidden returning characters, Cliff Anderson and Justice. But it's only available on the Guilty Gear Plus version, which is exclusive in Japan unfortunately. The other 2 secret characters are the 2 boss characters at the end of the arcade mode, Testament and Dizzy. And there's another secret character on the first version, Drobokai. If a player unlocks the Guilty Gear mode and use it to select Kai, there's a change in movesets, its voices, and its animation become a bit different. Unfortunately, looks doesn't change that much though. Still, a set of 17 characters is a decent amount for a fighting game. It's not as many compared to the other fighting games back then, but the quality of each character design looks amazing. They managed to refine each of the character sprites from the previous game and made it into a high quality version of them. Guilty Gear X really set up the bar for the 2D fighting games. Unlike how the other 2D fighting games made at these times, it kinda feels like they just imported old assets and made some new ones to add more content into it. This game on the other hand has a great innovation of what they did, proving how 2D fighting games still stands a chance against growing popularity of 3D fighting games before. In a fighting game, it usually have different sets of characters. The standard type that are well balanced, the fast type that does little amount of damage but has great maneuverability, the slow ones that can deal heavy amounts of damage at the cost of speed, and so on and so forth. But what I like about the game is how diverse each of the characters can be. You can clearly see the difference of every character, not only by their looks, but how diverse each of the movesets they have. As well as how some of the characters has their own unique mechanic to play as. Like how Johnny's burst kind of playstyle is equipped with a set of coins. If the coin hits the enemy for a set amount of times, Johnny could unleash a barrage set of attacks. It's a bit hard to pull it off on the whole coin stack mechanic thing, while the damage itself seemed a bit underwhelming, unfortunately. They could have at least scaled it up a bit more to balance things further, in my opinion. There's also Jam's mechanic where she charges up these slots in order to power up some of her moves. It's kinda like the same mechanic with the whole charging thing on the first Guilty Gear game, but instead, Jam is able to stack it up to 3 times with 4 different kinds of charges. Although some characters I noticed seem a bit underwhelming, namely Baiken and Anji Mito. I don't hate them in particular, I actually like their character design, but some of their moves just seem a bit lacking in a way. Not to mention how Faust, or Mr. Baldhead on the first game, had a huge overall improvement. Some of his moves are a bit different than before, but most of it seemed better. The story part, however, within the arcade mode seemed a bit lacking, to be honest. There's no engaging dialogue of each character near at the end of the game. The only thing a player could get after beating the game is this credit scene with a picture beside it. There's a few hints of how the story could be, but the context of it just seemed a bit missing. Unlike before, they prioritized the dialogues on their first game, making a good impression about the story. It's just sad how the game downgraded a bit when it comes to the story of the game. Guilty Gear X Plus version has a story mode, but again, it's exclusive in Japan, unfortunately. There's another thing what makes Guilty Gear series stands out, and that's the destroyability, or the instant kill as the manual says. The destroyability is an instant kill ability that could perform by every character. Just perform this set of input while being able to hit the enemy, and it unleashes a unique animation kill. It's a bit cheaty in a way when you think about it. Although it has its ups and downs, it can still be easily blocked by the enemy, and if it fails, your tension bar would disappear, making it impossible to do any specials further, or even do the destroyability again. Although Dizzy doesn't have a destroyability, but instead ends up having a powerful special that could be used. While Mei does have a destroyability, but her input for the destroyability is much harder to pull off. I'm not exactly quite sure why the developers decided this. In general, with the destroyability, it did improve quite a lot, unlike how things were back then, where you can spam the destroyability to push your luck. There's also the special ability of every character that uses 50% of the tension gauge right here below. To those who've played the first Guilty Gear game on the PS1, did you remember that charging mechanic that every character has? They end up scrapping that idea for good. The idea of it should have been alright, but it ends up being broken in a way. The whole charge mechanic setup ends up getting replaced with a new different mechanic instead, called Romantic. When 3 attack buttons are pressed at the same time during an attack animation, it'll cancel out the ongoing animation to freely do a next attack again. This ends up extending the possible combos that a player could do, or even do a feint attack in order to caught the enemy off guard, but at the cost of 50% of the tension, meaning you can't actually spam this move. Other than the arcade mode, there's also the survival mode in the game. This mode is the hardest one to finish though. Pairing up the player against unfair battles of an AI is a challenging battle. Although it's not like every AI in the survival mode is that hard to fight against, considering some of them are a bit dull. Kinda like what happened to me on this one. It took me days of using Faust just to reach the level 100 in the end, and it's not an easy feat. Now, the practice mode, however, have improved immensely compared to the first Guilty Gear game, where it feels empty there. And finally, the game already has each of every character's command list for real. Unlike before, the only command list you could see is on the loading screen of the game. What I'm really glad to see is how balanced the AI can already be. In a way, how they've already removed the whole unlimited special thing for the AI, and the high chance of the enemy doing a destroy move all of a sudden. Although it's kinda upsetting how I didn't manage to see the enemy trying to do a destroy move, not even once. I even tried to scale up the difficulty to the highest one, Maniac, and it's still the same thing. Like, come on. I know how the AI can be unfair back then on the first game, but it feels kinda different if they can't do the destroy move now. Although, it's a great thing to have a difficulty setting for those who are having trouble playing the game. There's no denying how amazing the overall art design within the game. The level of detail have improved greatly than before, especially when it comes to the level design within the game. The only bad art design that I could point out is the UI design for the character selection. It looks really simpler compared to the first Guilty Gear game. I know this sounds a bit nitpicking at this point, but it feels really underwhelming, especially when you pair it up to the rest of the design in the game. The soundtrack within the game has always been a remarkable piece to listen. It's not only just a great rock music overall, but how each of the characters' music blends really well with the characters. As such, when fighting against Mei, it has this adventurous, vibrant, upbeat music to it that's quite motivating to hear. Or when listening to Kai's theme or even Milia's, both of them has this illustrious, intense feeling to it, as if you're fighting against a boss instead of a regular opponent. I could go on and on about the music itself, but it's better to just give it a shot listening to it, especially if you're a fan of this genre of music, and especially if you like Rhapsody. Daisuke Ishiwatari's works on the Guilty Gear series is one of the best music of its genre that I've ever heard. One that has a unique signature of mix matching of music that blends really well within the game.
やめろやめろ始めましょう
That's why I give this game a rating of 8.6 out of 10. Guilty Gear X is an amazing game for its time. Not only how the overall art design looks great, but how unique the moves can be for a 2D fighting game. It's safe to say that Guilty Gear X for its time is the most innovative 2D fighting game made during the early years of PlayStation 2 times. It goes to show how 2D fighting games still has its charm compared to the 3D fighting games before. Although the game isn't exactly perfect, considering there's a few problems in the game that seem a bit rushed on the development of the game. Would I recommend you on playing the game or even on the other versions of it? Of course not. You wouldn't miss that much, to be honest. I highly recommend just try getting the Guilty Gear X2 version instead for the PS2. Or you could get the Steam version instead, the Guilty Gear XX Accent Core Plus, or... I know the name sounds too long, but it's better to be honest, rather than playing this game that seem a bit lacking in a way. For more videos such as these, why not head down to my channel to check things out? I do accurate game reviews of the past games, and some other new ones too. If you want to support my channel, a subscribe would be nice. This is K1PM, and I bid you farewell.